Joining me now, Warren Hogan, economic consultant of the small business lender Judo Bank. Warren, the interesting thing is if the Reserve Bank were to raise interest rates that you and I have talked about a lot, that's just going to make those surveys a whole bunch worse, isn't it?
Well, it may, and I think there's some suggestion that the talk of rate hikes is having an impact, particularly on consumer sentiment. But I think there's a couple of standout features, and having the two reports side by side highlights the most important. Consumer sentiment is in the pits, not far off recession levels, and it's been there for over 18 months. And that's all about the inflation, the cost of living squeeze. Business confidence and business conditions are down, but they're still around neutral, if not slightly positive. And that's in stark contrast. And this is very unusual. Normally, over the wide history, they move together. So this really is a nice sort of snippet on the economy. Very weak consumers, pressure on their income, businesses hanging in there.
So the one thing we do know is the consumer sentiment is generally weak, but the consumer and consumer demand makes up 50% of Australia's economy. So that being the case, surely the Reserve Bank would flop in favour of the consumer and trying to support them rather than trying to support business.
Well, to the point, I think we're seeing all the pressure being brought to bear on the consumers and the households in this economy. And that's because of not just inflation and the bracket creep and income tax burden that comes with that, but the rates as well. Businesses are actually navigating this pretty well. And I think we're going to see, and I think part of this survey for both mainly business, was that we've got tax cuts coming. We've got cost of living relief, and we've got this prospect of maybe a better consumer in the second half of the year. That remains to be seen. But of course, that's critical to this situation right now.
OK, can we maybe call something out here for the government and maybe therefore for the Reserve Bank? And that is maybe, just maybe, the dual mandate for the Reserve Bank to maintain inflation and at the same time try and keep full employment just simply doesn't work. That sometimes these things almost counteract each other and you can't have the magic pudding of both low inflation and low unemployment without some consequences.
Yeah, well, I mean, the history shows that there is only a very short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. There's no trade-off in the long term. You've got to get rid of the inflation. So the RBA is trying to be a bit cute, you might say, and trying to preserve the gains in employment from the pandemic and not crush the economy. But they're doing a great job because the economy is actually hanging in there pretty well. So, look, this all remains to be seen. But at the moment, I think that we are looking at some further rate hikes. I don't think that necessarily means the strategy's failed. It's just that it's a drawn-out strategy. The strategy fails is if we end up having more than a couple more rate hikes, if inflation starts to accelerate and we end up having 3 or 4 rate hikes dragging into next year and then ultimately a recession. So at the moment, it's an open question.
So, yeah, open question, righto. But then there's one other aspect of this, and that is that even if there were one rate hike, that might not be enough, or 2 rate hikes. That may not be enough to actually change behaviour and change the trajectory of the consumer and indeed the overall economy. It may need even more than that. That's the worrying thing, I would think, for some businesses and certainly for many consumers as well. And that, to your point, is where you might start looking at a significant recession for Australia's economy, which is going to be not good for the politics of Anthony Albanese or Jim Chalmers.
No, that's right. And look, there are reasons to be worried about that. And the main one for me is that our real interest rate is still very low. That is, we've only just got that cash rate above the inflation rate. And history shows that you need to get the real interest rate up to 2 or 3%. And that means the cash rate up another 200 basis points. Now, hopefully we're not in that world, but it does highlight the risk. So, look, the RBA is really going to have to ask the question, is 25 basis points enough? I think that's the conversation for the next 4 weeks. And I think they're probably going to need to see 50 if indeed they go. And then they can sit back and watch. Hopefully that gets the job done, but it's still an open question.
So what we've just described is a narrow path that the Reserve Bank sometimes talks about, that this is becoming increasingly narrow. So this is, again, the rhetoric coming straight out of the Reserve Bank Governor, Michelle Bullock. And so the dilemma for the Reserve Bank, the dilemma for the government right now is how do you actually go down this path without teetering off into a recession by having to cut the inflation by seriously putting up interest rates?
Yeah, and I think the real problem we've got is that this fiscal stimulus that's just commenced literally in the last few weeks and will flow through the economy over the year ahead. That was all formulated by the Federal Treasury and the Treasurer earlier in the year when it looked like the economy was slowing. It looked like 4.35% cash rate was enough, but the economy's actually looked a bit better and inflation's proved to be sticky. So if we do end up in a situation where we have multiple rate hikes over the next 12 months, I think that you can start to ask the question, was that wise to do that fiscal stimulus? And of course, that will be an issue for the government of their own doing.